The lash cracked, a sound like winter ice splitting, and Ilara's world narrowed to the fire that bloomed across her back. Dawn was a smear of blood on the eastern horizon, mirroring the stain spreading on her thin chemise. The cold bit at her exposed skin, a cruel counterpoint to the burning agony. Dust and spit clung to her matted hair where it had been torn from its pins. They had dragged her from the damp cell, her pleas for mercy swallowed by the pre-dawn chill and the murmurs of the assembled townsfolk. Mayor Thorne stood before her, his face a mask of righteous satisfaction, his words booming across the small, hushed square. Let this be a lesson. Disobedience. Defiance. This is the price. He gestured to the man with the whip, a burly blacksmith whose eyes held no malice, only a grim duty. Each strike was a punctuation mark to Thorne's pronouncements. She did not scream. The sounds were torn from her, raw, animal grunts of pain she could not contain, but she would not give them the satisfaction of a shriek. Her body arched, a grotesque parody of a dance, with each blow. Her hands, bound tight to the splintered post, were slick with her own blood, knuckles white. She remembered the accusations, a whirlwind of twisted words and pointed fingers. Refusing old Jedediah, the mayor's crony, thrice her age and twice as cruel. Whispers of witchcraft because she knew herbs, because her mother had been an outsider. It didn't matter the truth. She was a woman, alone, and therefore, a target. Her knees buckled. The world swam in a red haze. She could feel the collective gaze of the town, some avid, some shamed, but none moved to help. She was property to be disciplined, a stain to be cleansed. Her spirit, a tiny, stubborn flame, flickered, threatening to be snuffed out by the overwhelming tide of pain and degradation. She bit her lip until the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth, a small defiance they could not see. This was her lowest point, stripped bare, her dignity flayed along with her skin. Each breath was a torment. Another lash. She thought of the small, hidden locket her mother had given her, torn from her neck days ago. Her last link to a gentler past. Now, there was only this. The raw, unyielding present. The whip rose again. Ilara braced, a shudder running through her broken frame. She closed her eyes, not in surrender but in a desperate attempt to find some inner recess untouched by their cruelty. Then, a new sound. Hoofbeats. Not the plodding gait of a town horse, but the urgent, rhythmic thunder of a rider coming fast. Heads turned. Even the blacksmith paused, whip held aloft. Through the slits of her eyelids, Ilara saw a figure emerge from the grey morning light, a silhouette against the blooded sky. Tall in the saddle. A stranger. He rode directly towards the spectacle, his horse, a dark, powerful beast, scattering the edges of the crowd. There was an aura about him, an indomitable stillness that commanded attention more than any shouted word. He pulled up just shy of the post, his gaze sweeping over her, then settling on Mayor Thorne. His face was weathered, etched by sun and wind, his eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and clear. He wore no badge of authority, yet authority radiated from him. Mayor Thorne, flustered by the interruption, puffed out his chest. "Who are you, stranger?" "This is town business." Justice being done. The stranger's voice, when it came, was low, resonant, cutting through the morning air like a honed blade. It held no theatrics, only unshakable assertion. "This woman," he said, his eyes briefly meeting Ilara's, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, "is my bride." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Thorne's jaw dropped. The blacksmith lowered the whip, confusion warring with relief on his face. Ilara's heart, a frantic bird against her ribs, faltered. Bride? The word was an absurdity, a lifeline thrown into an abyss. The stranger dismounted in a single fluid motion. He moved with a quiet grace that spoke of strength held in reserve. He walked towards her, his gaze never leaving Mayor Thorne, who sputtered, "Bride? Preposterous! She is a wanton, a defiant wench. There's been no banns, no ceremony." The stranger reached the post. He didn't address Thorne again. Instead, he produced a knife, its blade gleaming dully in the weak light. With swift, economical movements, he sliced through the ropes binding Ilara's wrists. She swayed, her legs threatening to give way entirely. Before she could fall, a strong arm was around her waist, supporting her. The contact was shocking, firm, impersonal yet undeniably protective. He said nothing to her. He merely held her upright as he turned back to face the dumbfounded mare. "There will be no more justice here today," the stranger stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion but carrying an undeniable finality. He then bent, and with surprising gentleness, lifted Elara into his arms. She was light, a broken doll. Her head lolled against his shoulder, the rough fabric of his coat a strange comfort against her cheek. She could smell dust, leather, and pine. He carried her to his horse, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She clung to him, not out of affection, but sheer necessity, her consciousness fading in and out. The townspeople stared, silent now, their earlier righteousness replaced by a mixture of fear and awe. This man had defied their mayor, their laws, their collective will, with a few stark words and an unyielding presence. As the horse turned, ready to depart the square, Thorn finally found his voice, shrill and impotent. "You can't just, this is not over. I'll have the sheriff after you." The stranger didn't look back. He merely nudged the horse into a steady walk, then a canter, leaving the town, its judgments, and its cruelty behind. Elara, drifting on the edge of awareness, heard the receding shouts, then only the rhythmic beat of hooves, the creak of leather, and the steady thump of the stranger's heart beneath her ear. Each beat seemed to say, "Safe, safe, safe." But her mind, battered and bruised, could only whisper, "Who? Why?" The sun was higher now, but its warmth did not reach her. The journey was a blur of pain and jolting movement. She felt the stranger's arm securely around her, a human shield against the world. Sometime later, the rhythm of the horse slowed, the terrain growing rougher. Pine scent filled the air, sharp and clean. She risked a glance from beneath her lashes. They were climbing, leaving the flat valley of the town far below. Mountains loomed, cloaked in mist. The air grew colder, purer. He said nothing. The silence was vast, broken only by the horse's breath and the rustle of wind through unseen trees. She must have lost consciousness fully then, for the next thing she knew, she was lying on something soft, a rough-spun blanket beneath her. The jolting had stopped. A low fire crackled nearby, casting flickering shadows on rough-hewn log walls. She was in a cabin. Small. Stark. Utterly isolated. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her pain. Where was he? Was this another trap? She tried to sit up, a cry tearing from her throat as her back protested with a fresh wave of agony. A shadow fell over her. The stranger stood there, a dipper of water in his hand. His expression was unreadable. He knelt beside the pallet he had made for her near the hearth. He offered the water. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked. She hesitated, fear warring with desperate thirst. He did not press, merely held it steady. Slowly, she reached out a trembling hand. He guided the dipper to her lips. The water was cool, tasting faintly of minerals. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. He watched her drink, his eyes missing nothing. When she finished, he took the dipper. He still said nothing. He rose and went to a small table, returning with a clean rag and a bowl of warm water. He gestured to her back. Shame, hot and overwhelming, washed over her. To be tended by this man, this stranger who had claimed her with a lie. But the pain was a relentless master. She nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. With surprising gentleness for such a large, rough-looking man, he began to clean the blood and grime from her wounds. His touch was impersonal, methodical, yet not unkind. Each dab of the warm cloth sent shivers of pain through her, but also a strange sense of release. He worked in silence, his breathing the only sound apart from the fire's whisper. She lay face down, her cheek pressed against the blanket, every muscle tensed. She could feel the heat of the fire on one side, the cool draft from the door on the other. The cabin was sparsely furnished, a rough table, 2 stools, a stone hearth, shelves holding a few provisions. His bedroll was in the far corner. A rifle leaned against the wall. This was a man who lived alone, accustomed to solitude. When he was done cleaning, he applied a salve that smelled of pine and something else, something bitter but soothing. It cooled the burning. Then, he carefully draped a clean, much-patched shirt over her shoulders, one of his own, the fabric coarse but welcome. He stood. "Rest," he said. His first word to her in this sanctuary. It was not a request, but a simple statement of fact. He moved to the fire, adding a log. He did not look at her again that evening, giving her the privacy of his averted gaze. Elara lay there, adrift in a sea of confusion and exhaustion. Rescued. Sheltered. By a man who called her his bride and then treated her like a wounded animal he had taken in. Sleep, when it finally came, was heavy and dreamless, a temporary oblivion from a world that had shown her only cruelty until this man, this enigma, had ridden out of the dawn. The days that followed unfolded in a slow, quiet rhythm, measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the crackle of the hearth fire, the silent presence of the rancher, Silas. He never called her by a name, for he did not know it, and she did not offer it. She was simply the woman he had rescued. He rarely spoke. His communication was in actions. Fresh water by her pallet each morning. A bowl of thin stew or broth left on the hearth. Firewood replenished silently. He moved about his small cabin and the surrounding patch of cleared land with a purposeful economy, every action necessary, nothing wasted. Elara watched him from beneath lowered lashes, her fear slowly, almost imperceptibly, giving way to a cautious curiosity. He was a man of immense capability. She saw it in the way he handled his axe, splitting logs with clean, powerful strokes. In the way he moved through the dense wood surrounding the cabin, silent as a shadow. In the way he tended his few animals, a milk cow, a handful of chickens, with a rough but effective care. Her wounds began to heal. The raw, open stripes on her back scabbed over, then slowly faded to angry red welts, then to puckered scars that would forever map her ordeal. Each morning, she would tentatively touch them, a reminder of what she had endured, and what she had, somehow, survived. Silas never mentioned them, never looked at them after that first tending. He gave her space, an ocean of it, in the confines of their shared isolation. She spent those first days mostly on the pallet, gaining strength. The pain was a constant companion, but it lessened its grip bit by bit. She ate what he provided, slowly, deliberately. The food was plain, salt pork, beans, cornmeal mush, but it was sustenance, and she was grateful. One morning, she woke to find a worn, mended dress laid out beside her pallet. It was not hers. It was simple, homespun, clearly old but clean. With considerable effort and biting back cries of pain, she managed to put it on. It was too large, hanging loosely on her thin frame, but it was covering. It was dignity. When Silas returned from checking his snares, he glanced at her, a slight, almost imperceptible nod his only acknowledgement. That day, she took her first steps outside the cabin. The air was sharp, clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. The ranch was nestled in a small, high meadow, surrounded by towering peaks. It was beautiful, in a stark, untamed way. A world away from the claustrophobic judgment of the town. She saw him watching her from the lean-to where he was mending a harness. He did not approach. He let her explore her small, new world on her own terms. Slowly, she began to do small things. She swept the cabin floor with a crude broom. She washed their few dishes in a bucket of water he hauled from the creek. He said nothing, but she noticed he left the broom propped by the door, the wash bucket where she could reach it. One afternoon, he was sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a familiar sound. He had a pile of kindling that needed splitting into smaller pieces. Tentatively, she picked up the small hatchet lying nearby. It was heavy in her hand. She looked at him. He paused his sharpening, watched her. He did not offer to help, nor did he stop her. She positioned a piece of wood, swung awkwardly. The hatchet bounced off. Her cheeks burned. She tried again, focusing, remembering how he held his shoulders, the way he brought the axe down. This time, the wood split, albeit unevenly. A small triumph. She continued, slowly, painstakingly, splitting the kindling. When she was done, a small pile lay beside the larger logs. Silas resumed his sharpening. He had taught her without a word. Trust was not a conscious decision, but a slow dawning. It grew in the shared silences, in the unspoken understanding of their routines. He asked nothing of her, not even her story. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, most degraded, and had offered sanctuary without condition. This absence of expectation was a balm to her bruised spirit. She began to mend her own borrowed dress, her fingers clumsy with the needle he left on the table. She found a patch of hardy herbs growing near the creek and gathered them, recognizing some her mother had used for healing. She crushed them and, one evening, silently offered him a poultice for a deep cut on his hand he'd gotten while fencing. He looked at the offering, then at her, his expression unreadable. He allowed her to apply it. His hand was calloused, strong. Her fingers trembled slightly as she bandaged it with a strip of clean cloth. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, almost rough, but they resonated in the small cabin. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything. She merely nodded, her gaze dropping. One evening, a fierce storm swept down from the mountains. Wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters. Rain lashed against the roof. The fire in the hearth seemed the only point of warmth and light in a chaotic world. Silas checked the door, secured the shutters. He sat on his stool, staring into the flames, his usual quiet deepening into something more profound. Ilara sat on her pallet, watching him. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil she often felt within. In a lull in the wind, she heard him murmur something, too low to be distinct words, more like a breath of old sorrow. She saw his hand clench, the one she had bandaged. A glimpse of the man behind the stoic facade. A hint of the past tragedy that shaped him. She did not speak, did not intrude on his private grief. But a new layer of understanding settled between them. They were two solitary souls, scarred by their pasts, finding a fragile peace in this isolated haven. The fire crackled, a small beacon against the storm's fury, a symbol of the safety he provided, the warmth that was slowly, tentatively, beginning to thaw the ice around her heart. Her name was Ilara. She hadn't spoken it aloud in what felt like a lifetime. But in the quiet of the cabin, as the storm raged outside, she whispered it to herself. A reclamation. A beginning. The weeks bled into a month, then two. The mountain autumn painted the surrounding peaks in hues of gold and crimson. Ilara's scars faded from angry red to pale silver lines against her skin, a permanent testament to her survival. Her body healed, and with it, slowly, her spirit. She moved with a newfound purpose, her steps surer, her gaze less haunted. She had learned the rhythms of the ranch, the language of Silas's silences. She could tell by the set of his jaw if the snares were empty, by the way he mended a tool if his thoughts were troubled. She learned to chop wood with a steady, efficient swing, to tend the small vegetable patch she had started, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. Silas had given her a worn pair of his old trousers and a sturdy shirt, which she wore for work, the unfamiliar garments a symbol of her changing existence. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, learning to be self-reliant. One crisp morning, as Silas was preparing to hunt, he paused at the door. He held out a small, carefully sharpened knife. "Woods are not always empty," he said. It was not a gift of aggression, but of preparedness. She took it, the cool steel accompanying weight in her hand. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. He nodded, then slipped out into the dawn mist. She watched him go, a familiar ache in her chest that was not entirely fear, but something akin to concern. He was always the protector, but who protected him? That afternoon, while she was checking a line of snares Silas had shown her, closer to the cabin, she heard the distinct sound of horses approaching from the trail that led down to the valley. Not Silas's deliberate tread. These were multiple riders, moving with an unwelcome confidence. Her heart leaped into her throat. The past, which had receded to a dull ache, suddenly clawed its way back, sharp and visceral. She slipped the knife from her belt, her hand instinctively finding the handle. She did not run. Running was what the old Ilara would have done. This Ilara, the one forged in pain and tempered by Silas's quiet strength, stood her ground. 3 riders emerged from the trees. Mayor Thorn, flanked by the town sheriff and another burly man she didn't recognize, likely hired muscle. Thorn's face, when he saw her, twisted into a smug sneer. Well, well. Look who we found. Thought you could hide up here forever, did you, girl? Ilara said nothing, her eyes narrowed, her stance deceptively relaxed but ready. The sheriff cleared his throat, holding up a piece of parchment. Ilara Vance, he intoned, by order of the Township of Redemption, you are to return to face proper judgment for your crimes of defiance and fleeing lawful punishment. I committed no crime, Ilara stated, her voice low but carrying clearly in the still mountain air. It surprised her, the steadiness of it. Thorn laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Still defiant, I see. Your bridegroom are not here to protect you today. Just then, another sound. A twig snapping in the woods behind Thorn's men. Silas emerged, silent as a wraith, his rifle held loosely in his hand, its barrel pointing towards the ground, yet its presence was a palpable threat. His eyes, cold as glacial ice, fixed on Thorn. She is home, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. This is her home. Thorn visibly flinched but tried to maintain his bluster. This is a matter of law, rancher. She belongs to the town. She's a fugitive. She belongs to herself, Ilara interjected, stepping forward slightly. Her gaze met Thorn's, unwavering. I am not yours. I am not this town's. I am not running this time. She held the small knife loosely at her side, not as a weapon to attack, but as a statement of her unwillingness to be taken. The mayor's eyes darted between Silas's rifle and Ilara's defiant stance. The hired man shifted uneasily. The sheriff looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Silas took a step, positioning himself beside Ilara, not in front of her. A silent affirmation of support. Then we'll stand, he said simply, his gaze never leaving Thorn. The words were a quiet promise of unyielding resistance. Thorn's bravado began to crumble. He had come expecting a frightened, broken woman. He found instead a united front, a quiet resilience he couldn't bully, and a man who looked ready to defend his ground to the death. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Only the rustle of autumn leaves in the breeze broke the tension. Thorn looked at Ilara, truly looked at her. He saw not the whipped victim from the square, but a woman whose eyes held a strength he hadn't anticipated. He saw the subtle changes in her, the way she stood, the calm resolve in her face. He saw the man beside her, a silent, immovable mountain. This isn't over, Thorn blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. He tugged at his horse's reins. We'll be back. With more men, but Ilara knew, and Silas knew, that they wouldn't. The cost was too high, the outcome too uncertain. They had misjudged her? They had misjudged him. Thorn and his men wheeled their horses around, retreating back down the trail, their departure far less imposing than their arrival. Ilara watched them go, her breath slowly steadying. She didn't lower the knife until they were out of sight. Silas's rifle remained in his hand. When the sound of their horses faded, a profound quiet settled over the clearing. Ilara turned to Silas. Her hand, still clutching the knife, was trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. He looked at her, his expression unreadable as ever, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of respect, perhaps even pride. He reached out, not to take the knife, but to gently cover her hand with his own, his calloused fingers stilling her tremor. You stood, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She nodded, a lump in her throat. We stood, she corrected, her voice barely a whisper. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips. He released her hand. The confrontation was over. She had faced her past, not with violence, but with the strength she had found within herself, nurtured in this wild, solitary place, beside this quiet, steadfast man. The air felt cleaner, the sunlight brighter. A chapter had closed. The shadows of Mayor Thorne and his cruel system had receded, banished by her newfound voice and their shared resolve. Ilara walked back towards the cabin, Silas a comforting presence beside her. The scars on her back still ached sometimes, a dull reminder of the pain, but now they were also a testament to her journey from the whipping post to this moment of quiet triumph. She had not sought vengeance, only dignity and autonomy. And in the shelter of these mountains, in the company of this stoic protector, she was beginning to find both. The confrontation with Thorne marked a turning point. A palpable shift occurred in the quiet rhythm of life at the ranch. The threat, though perhaps not entirely extinguished, had been faced and repelled. Ilara had found her voice, and in doing so, had reclaimed a vital part of herself. She was no longer merely surviving, she was living, building a life from the ashes of her old one. The silence between her and Silas remained, but it was different now, imbued with a deeper understanding, a shared history. It was the comfortable silence of companionship, not the wary silence of strangers. They worked side by side, a natural partnership falling into place. She learned to read the land, the weather, the subtle signs of animal movement, her senses sharpening in the wild, clean air. He taught her to track, to hunt small game with snares and eventually with a small, older rifle he kept, his instruction patient, his corrections gentle gestures rather than words. She, in turn, brought a different kind of life to the solitary ranch. The small vegetable patch flourished under her care, providing a welcome variety to their diet. She mended their clothes with increasing skill, her stitches neat and strong. She even found a patch of wild berries and, after carefully ensuring they were safe, made a crude, sweet jam, a taste of unexpected luxury. One afternoon, while checking a snare line further than usual, she found a young hawk, its wing broken, caught in the remnants of an old, forgotten trap not set by Silas. Its eyes were wild with fear and pain. Her first instinct, born of her own experiences, was compassion. Carefully, she freed the bird, her movement slow and deliberate. It pecked at her, drawing blood, but she persisted. She carried it back to the cabin, its small, trembling body surprisingly light. Silas watched, his expression unreadable, as she fashioned a splint for its wing from twigs and strips of cloth. He didn't question her, didn't interfere. He simply observed. She tended the hawk for weeks, feeding it scraps of meat, keeping it warm by the fire. Slowly, the bird began to trust her, its wildness tempered by her consistent care. Silas would sometimes watch her with it, a strange softness in his usually stern eyes. The day she released it, its wing fully healed, was a quiet triumph. She watched it soar into the vast blue sky, a wild thing returning to its element, free. When she turned, Silas was standing nearby. He handed her a small, intricately carved wooden feather, so realistic she could almost feel its softness. He had made it himself, in his silent hours. "For the hawk," he said. His voice was gruff, but his eyes held a warmth that spoke volumes. She took the feather, her fingers tracing its delicate lines. It was more than just a carving, it was an acknowledgement, a gift of understanding. Her own emotional wounds were healing, much like the hawk's wing. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were less frequent, their edges softened by the reality of her present safety, her growing strength. She even began to hum sometimes as she worked, old tunes her mother had taught her, fragments of a life before the darkness. Silas never commented, but she would sometimes see him pause, listening, a faint shadow of a smile on his lips. His own past remained largely a mystery, revealed only in fleeting glimpses, a faded photograph of a woman and child he kept tucked away in an old tin box, a certain sadness that would settle in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. But Ilara didn't pry. She understood that some wounds were too deep for words, best left to heal in their own time, in their own way. She respected his silence as he had respected hers. Their bond was not one of declarations, but of shared experience, mutual respect, and a profound, unspoken affection that had grown in the fertile ground of their shared solitude. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a home, built not just of logs and stone, but of trust and resilience. The world outside, with its cruelties and judgments, still existed, but it held less power over her now. She had found her sanctuary, her strength, and in the quiet company of this stoic rancher, a new beginning. The cycle of victimhood was broken. She was Ilara, the resilient survivor, her spirit, once a flickering flame, now burning steady and bright, a beacon in the wilderness. And beside her stood Silas, the quiet protector, his own solitary path now intertwined with hers, leading them towards a future they would face together, their unspoken bond as strong and enduring as the mountains that cradled their home.